the Year of the Bible podcast, brought to you by Belle Aire Baptist Church in Murfreesboro, Tennessee.
Welcome to the Belle Aire Baptist Church's Year of the Bible podcast. I'm Steve Hillar, along with Pastor Grant Gaines. And Grant, we come to the book of Job in our reading this week. And even before we get into the content of the book of Job, I know there's a little debate as to when this book was even written and who wrote it.
Yeah, there are. In many of the biblical books, we have a pretty good understanding of when they were written because we know who wrote them. We don't know exactly who wrote the book of Job.
Now, in my chronological Bible, it comes back around Genesis time.
That's right. So many of you probably who have read the Bible through before, maybe you've done a chronological Bible reading, and it will be right there in Genesis, mixed somewhere up in Genesis. And that's because a lot of scholars do think that Job was written very early on in terms of biblical history. One of the reasons is you don't really have any references to things like the temple and things like that are prominent features in the life of the people of God. So some say, well, this is like before the temple, before the kingdom and all those things. But then there are other scholars who say, no. There's a lot of evidence in the book of Job that actually this was written much later, maybe even during the time of the exile or after the exile. And that's because there are several passages in the book of Job that, as you read through them, sound like other passages. So it could be that the author of Job here is alluding to or echoing other passages from books like Isaiah and Jeremiah, and especially the Psalms. As you read through some of this, there's a lot of echo and similar language that's used in the Psalms. And so that would suggest that maybe the author here is, and even Job himself, as he's giving voice to his lament and prayer and all these things, it sounds like he's echoing some of the Psalms, which means that this would have come after the Psalms were written. So the fact is, we don't really know when the book of Job was written, and I think that is okay. There are not any things in the book of Job that are trying to tell us when it was written. It doesn't say this was written during the time of such and such, and I think that's the point. That some of these truths in this book they're so timeless. That this is meant, as the whole Bible is, to have principles that really apply to anyone at any time and place. And this is one of the darkest and most depressing books in the Bible.
Yeah.
And I think the timeless element is meant to suggest that God's people are always going to be able to resonate with the book of Job. Yeah. No matter what time period they're living in, you're going to have suffering. And that's just a post-Genesis 3 fallen world thing. And the book of Job expresses that so well.
As you've already kind of alluded to, there does seem to be different genres in the book of Job, reflections of the Psalms in there, and, possible alluding to other Old Testament books. And so is there a genre that Job actually is, or is it like a combination of things?
It's kind of become popular over the past couple of decades for people to lump this into the wisdom literature category. I think one of the reasons that people do that is because one of the other books that it seems to echo is the book of Proverbs, especially in the big section in the middle of Job when Job's friends are trying to explain to him why he's in the situation he's in, which is not the right approach, by the way, when someone is suffering. But they quote things that sound like they come almost straight out of the book of Proverbs. And I think that's one of the reasons people have said this is wisdom literature. But I think the book of Job is more complex than that. To me, it's more similar to Psalms of Lament. That's one of the main things you see in Job. And really, there's more than one genre of biblical literature in the book of Job. There's some historical narrative. That's how the book begins. This is about a real man who really lived, and it tells the story of his life. But then again, there are things that are Psalms of Lament that are present here, and there is some wisdom literature coming out of the mouths of mostly Job's friends, and there's a lot of drama kind of here. So there's a lot of different kind of literature, I think, in the book of Job. You can't just pin it down to one thing.
All right, so you've already begun to talk a little bit about some of the content and structure of the book. It starts with narrative, then there's his friends who really seem to be railing against him. So let's begin to break it down a little bit here.
So it begins, and really I think the major theme of the book is the righteous sufferer. The righteous sufferer. Why, good people are experiencing bad situations and circumstances. And that's how the book begins. The very first verse says there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Now, we know that it's not saying that he never did sin ever in his whole life, right? All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But the pattern of his life was that this was a godly man. Now, how do we read that as people who have understood what the rest of the Old Testament is saying? Well, you know that when the people of God are told, when like in Deuteronomy 28, when you go into the promised land and you obey,
You will
I'm
be
going to bless you.
Yep.
And when you disobey, I'm going to curse you. Okay, so the book of Job begins by putting us in that mindset. This is a righteous man. We should expect to read that the rest of his life is going to be all about God blessing him.
It appears that had held true up to this point because he was abundantly blessed. Yeah,
and you see that at the beginning and at the end.
Yeah,
but all the middle is kind of breaking the mold here and unexpected. And so it starts off talking about how righteous Job is, but then it immediately gets into his suffering. You know the story. Satan is allowed to test Job.
Yeah,
God never tempts us. Hebrews tells us that God never tempts us, but God does test us. And one of the things we learn here is that sometimes God allows, through his providence, the enemy who tempts us to be a kind of test for us. So while Satan is tempting Job and wanting him to fail, God is testing Job and wanting him to succeed. That's the difference. And both those things can be happening at the same time. So Satan comes and he afflicts him. I mean, in chapter 2, he loses everything. In chapter 3, the end of chapter 1, rather, he loses everything. In chapter 2, he loses his health. It's really, really bad. And then you get to the majority of the book of Job, which is the speeches of his friends. Now, when you read this, it doesn't take the form of a very kind of just a natural conversation. It's not very conversational.
Yeah.
Instead, this is presented, and this is kind of another aspect of the genre of Job. It's presented almost like a court case. Okay, scholars have noticed this. Like, Job makes his case, I'm innocent, right? You've got the person who's saying they're innocent. And then Job's friends are coming almost as witnesses in a certain sequential order, and they're making their case against Job to say, here's why you're not innocent. And by the way, again, I think one of the big takeaways and principles here is the middle part of the book of Job with Job's friends' speeches is showing us a negative example to avoid. This is not how you deal with suffering people. You don't try to explain to them why they're suffering for their own mistakes, especially if you know that this is a righteous person. And so what the friends should have done was what they began to do, which is to sit with him, to be there for him. But as soon as they start opening their mouths, they really say some things that end up harming him more than helping him. Now, as you read what these friends say, you might on the surface think, well, they kind of have a point.
It seems as if they could, yeah.
It does. Again, it almost seems as if Job's friends are saying things that would come straight out of a book like Proverbs. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. You've got in chapter 4, one of Job's friends named Eliphaz speaks and says this in verses 7 through 11. He says, "Remember, who that was innocent ever perished? Or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they are consumed." Now, stop right there for a moment. He says here, Eliphaz, one of Job's friends, who we know in the whole book they're wrong. Job really was innocent.
Yeah.
The explanation for why Job suffers is never given, even by God, when God responds. Okay? And Eliphaz is trying to say the reason you're suffering is because you have done something wicked, and this is God's punishment. Or, as he says here, literally, Job, you are reaping what you have sown. So Eliphaz again says, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. Eliphaz is stating something that isn't completely false. In general, we know that the Bible does teach this principle that in general, we reap what we sow.
Yeah.
Okay, the foolish person will reap destruction. The wise person in the book of Proverbs reaps blessing in general. And so much of what all these friends are saying does seem to kind of be things that are true, at least on the surface, things that the Bible elsewhere does teach, like the principle you reap what you sow. And here's, I think, the point. Here's where Job's friends go wrong. They have what I would say is a simplistic view of wisdom precepts and of the way retributive justice works. Here's what I mean by that, or the whole principle of you reap what you sow works. They have a simplistic view of wisdom precepts. When you look at the book of Proverbs, we make a mistake when we read the book of Proverbs as a book of promises that are always true no matter what. Okay, the book of Proverbs is not a set of promises that are always true without exception. The book of Proverbs is a set of patterns that are generally true most of the time. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Proverbs 22:6 says, "Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it." Well, that is a pattern that is true most of the time. But we all know exceptions to that.
Right.
We all know godly parents who have, tried as hard as they can to train up their children the way that they should go. And when those children grew into adults, they did depart from it.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean this verse isn't true, because the intention of the author of Proverbs is not to give us promises that are always true without exceptions, but patterns that are generally true most of the time. So it's still true that most of the time when you train up a child in the way that they should go, that when they're old, they won't depart from it. So Job's friends, though, are treating these wisdom precepts as if they are promises that are always true without exception. Same way with the idea that you reap what you sow, retributive justice, that you're always going to get what you deserve, that you're always going to reap whatever you have sown. So, Job, if you're suffering, you must have sown some unrighteousness and sin that you're being punished for. Now you're reaping what you have sown. Well, again, with that principle, it's generally true that we reap what we sow. That's why the Bible teaches that elsewhere. But there are also exceptions to that principle. And one of the whole, I think, points of the book of Job is to teach us that there are exceptions to some of these patterns. And that in a fallen world, in a chaotic world, there are going to be situations where the wicked prosper and where the righteous suffer. And where you reap things that you didn't sow.
Yeah.
And, both if you've sown wicked things, sometimes you reap good things, and when you sow righteous things, you reap bad things, and so there are exceptions to that. You see this in like the book of Psalms. One of the things that the psalmist is frequently lamenting is this same question: why are the righteous suffering?
Yeah,
and that question of why the righteous would suffer is not even a legitimate question if you always reap what you sow, because if you always reap what you sow, then the righteous would never reap suffering. The righteous would always reap blessing.
Yeah.
And so Psalm 73, for example, the psalmist says this. He says, "Behold, these are the wicked, always at ease, they increase in riches." So the wicked people, sometimes they're wealthy and rich and they're blessed. And then he says about himself, "All in vain have I kept my heart clean and washed my hands in innocence. For all the day long I've been stricken and rebuked every morning." He's like, I'm righteous, and yet I'm suffering.
Yep.
But I noticed that all these wicked people out there are thriving. What's up with that? That the psalmist is lamenting that. And that's exactly, I think, the situation Job's in.
Yeah.
He's righteous and he's suffering. And his friends have a very simplistic view of the way the principle of reaping what you sow works.
Sure.
And so that's why what they say to him is so off. And God rebukes them for it.
God rebukes them. And, as we get to the end of the book, we see that God actually, there's like judgment that they would experience, and Job ends up having to pray for them. But before we get to that, God does show up. And in a sense, I feel like, and this is maybe oversimplistic, but, God's like, all right, you want to question me? Before you do, put your big boy pants on, because we're going to talk here, Job. I've got some questions for you.
He answers him out of the whirlwind, right? In Job 38, and he says, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" And, I think he's talking about both what Job's friends have been saying and some of what Job has been saying. And he says, "Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding," right? Like, Job, you wouldn't even, if I tried to explain to you all the ways that my plans and my ways are working, you wouldn't even be able to understand it. You know, you can't even understand the way creation is made, and much less the way my providence is directing things in creation. And so God, I think, kind of puts Job in his place by showing him just how awesome and holy and powerful and mighty he is. And yet, even though that is somewhat of a correction of where Job is going, we're never told that Job sinned in all of this. I think, again, Job is expressing lamentation here.
Yeah.
He is lamenting the fact that he is suffering. And so many of the Psalms of lament are that way. Lord, why? How long must the righteous suffer? It's okay to ask those questions.
Yeah.
It's okay to express to God what you're really feeling, and then God just reminds him of his sovereignty. And then Job winds up responding, the right way. And Job says this in Job's confession. It says, Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. This is chapter 42. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. And so, that he responds the right way. He trusts in the Lord and acknowledges his sovereignty. And I think that there's so many reasons why Job has been such a precious book for the church throughout church history. And, one of the things I think that it just teaches us is the importance of persevering to the end. James 5:11 says, Behold, we consider those blessed who remained steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, James says.
Yeah.
Everybody knows about Job, and one of the main takeaways is be steadfast like Job was.
Yeah.
Even when you don't understand, even when you're facing consequences that are seemingly undeserved, persevere. And it forces us to kind of answer, I think, this question. Will we trust God and believe that he's good and worthy of our worship no matter what circumstances we face in life?
Yeah.
That's the question I think God is asking us in this book. And he's saying it's possible. It's possible to trust me, to think I'm good, and to trust me no matter what circumstances you face. Here's an example in this righteous man, Job. You be like him, and ultimately Job isn't even the greatest example of that.
Right. I was going to say, in our last moments here, we've got to actually take a look at where we see Jesus in the book of Job, because all throughout the Bible story, we're looking for him.
Well, if the main theme of the book of Job is the righteous sufferer and how we're to wrap our minds around that, I don't think you have a better example of what a righteous sufferer looks like than Jesus Christ himself. There's no one who is more righteous than him, and there's no one who suffered greater than him. Jesus is without blemish. He is without sin, and no one has ever experienced all the depths of what he experienced on the cross when he took on the full wrath of God for all the sin of humanity. He is the ultimate innocent and righteous sufferer who perseveres, and is steadfast to the very end. And like the book of Job at the very end, he gets all this stuff restored.
Yeah.
And in the same way, Jesus perseveres to the end, suffers even though he's righteous, and then at the resurrection and ascension, all of it is restored to him tenfold, Yeah. So, Jesus fulfills the book of Job.
Well, we're just scratching the surface in our podcast this week. There's so much more to the book of Job, but I hope that as you've been listening and as you've been watching, it's been helpful and even encouraging to take a look at the broad overview of the book of Job. And if you want more information about the broad overview of the entire Bible story, I encourage you to come check out our website. It's belleirebc.com/Bible. More information and resources there to help you as we read through the Bible together this year. You can also like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you've connected on us with, and encourage you to do that. Or again, come check out the website, belleirebc.com/Bible.
Thank you for listening to the Year of the Bible podcast. For more information about Belle Aire Baptist Church, go to belleirebc.com.